I did just drop the resources in there if for some reason you wanted to follow along. Her PowerPoints are also in the folder in there too. And so if you guys ever want to take notes on those, you sure can, or whatnot. I'm going to go ahead and I know that I see some faces on here that maybe weren't on the first webinar series. And so we'll have Darcy go ahead and introduce herself and maybe give a quick background, just so we know who she is. And we are so excited to have her helping us with this series. And as people join, you'll see that I'll drop that same webinar link, because we all know that if you just join, you don't get all the previous messages in the chat. So ignore. But again, please feel free always to answer questions, ask questions, or she'll answer questions, ask questions in the chat. If you don't feel comfortable, by all means, directly message me or unmute when you feel comfortable, and engage with Darcy on any of the content. And with that, I'm going to let Darcy take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Leanne. My name is Darcy Cole, and I work right next door to you in Minnesota. I work at the University of Minnesota. I'm a 4-H program operations educator. So what that means is my role, I have kind of the bottom half of Minnesota, so southern half, and I support all the things people love about their jobs: finances, risk management, contracts and agreements, insurance, all of that kind of stuff is kind of where my role lies. I also, as you probably guessed from today's topic, I do some work with disability here in Minnesota. For me, I have worked with Extension for 18 years. First 17 of that was in local roles, and then the last year or so has been in this different role with operations. And for me, I bring both that professional experience, working with those young people in our program that might have a disability, but I also bring that personal experience. I have 4 kids. My oldest 2 both have autism, very different ends of the spectrum autism, and you'll probably hear me talk a little bit about some of those things as we kind of talk through this series of trainings that we're going to do. As Leanne mentioned, this is number 2 of training. So last time we really did just an intro to disability and provided some overview of some best practices. This time we'll talk accommodations, and then the next one we will talk about an accommodation kit that your state will be getting, a handful of those that you'll have at your disposal to hopefully use within your program. So, and then we'll have some follow-up ones from there. But that's kind of the plan for today and why I am here. What we're going to talk through, kind of those objective pieces, is I hope that you'll learn some about accommodations. We'll define accommodations. We'll talk about it in general terms. We will explore some different types of accommodations that you might specifically choose to use. And then there'll also be a time, like I'll share throughout, a lot of ideas of accommodations that might help your 4-Hers and volunteers in your program. As Leanne mentioned, definitely unmute, put in the chat if you have questions, or if there's, ideas that come up based on kind of what I'm talking about. And there will be some pieces where, I'm going to ask you to be interactive and ask you to answer some things kind of as we go. So that's kind of the plan today in this short hour that we'll have. So I have 2 scenarios. So I don't think timing wise we'll have time to do both. So I want to know from all of you, and you can either put in the chat. Is probably the best way to do it. And we'll walk through one of the scenarios, and then when you see the slides, you can see the answers for the rest. But and we're going to think about the different environments, because we know that we work in a ton of different environments in our 4-H work. And there's a lot of things in all of those different environments that we need to think about as we're thinking about how we can best support young people and volunteers with disabilities, and how we might need to put accommodations in place to make them be successful. So I want you to put in chat either like a livestock show running experience, if that feels the most applicable to your work, or if the other sample I will have is about kind of a experience kind of in walking trails, like maybe at a camp, if you're doing a residential or day camp experience, where you might be, like, say, walking through some trails in a park or that type of thing. So if you could put in the chat which of the 2 is more applicable to your work and your role, either a livestock show experience or, like I said, a camp, trail, environmental type of experience. Okay, so I'm seeing lots of camp type of ones there. So far, very overwhelmingly a camp thing. There's a few livestock ones coming in. Okay, some both. Okay, I'll give you like 15 seconds yet to put your answer in there if you haven't yet, and then we'll look at that based on which one looks the most applicable to all of you. Awesome. And Sarah's got a comment in there about having their first champion over challenges show. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. All right, so it looks like camp is probably our most applicable experience. And like I said, you'll see them both in the slides. You can look at them both. But really, the goal of this is to look at the environment in which our 4-Hers might be participating and try and think about what type of barriers or challenges they might face. So you're going to see a bunch of things pop on the screen here as I'm kind of going here. We weren't going to talk a ton about them, but you can kind of see there's some of the barriers and you'll see them in the slides. So, so we're really going to look at right now, specifically that camp, that environmental outdoors type of environment. If you can unmute or put in the chat some of the things that we might want to think about when we're thinking about young people that have a disability in our 4-H programs in this type of environment, on this trail type of setting. So what do you see that we might want to consider? Like I said, you can throw those things in the chat. So we're looking at walking on uneven terrain, absolutely. That it might be dark, the distance of the walk for sure, the temperature or light sensitivities, sound, barriers to wheelchair users, absolutely, the walk. So lots of things for us to think about. I'll give you maybe just a few more seconds to put anything in there that you feel maybe got missed on the answers that have come in so far. Allergies to plants and materials, for sure. Yep, another allergy one. All right, so I'm going to click through them kind of like we saw in that livestock one. There'll be some ideas that will come up. There's a lot of things to think about. Tripping hazards for everyone, for sure. So here's some things for us to think about when we have a young person with a disability that might be participating in this type of environment in a 4-H program. Dustin's got in there giving instructions to hearing impaired. Yeah, there's a lot of environmental things that might tune those out. So, all right, so let's look at some of the things you might want to think about. One of those is steps, and you all mentioned might not be accessible for wheelchair, uneven terrain, right? All of those things. You know, in some, at least here in Minnesota, some state parks have special wheelchairs that people can rent out or borrow that make them a little more trail accessible. However, when you've got these logs in the middle there, I don't think that's going to be, even if you get a fancy wheelchair to help with that. Yep, so steps for sure. The incline, right? Sometimes just that incline for people who are totally able-bodied, it can be challenging, right, over a period of time. So if you think about someone who maybe has a little bit more difficulty with walking or some of those gross movement type of activities, that incline might tire them out super quickly compared to other type of environments. Narrow pathway, again, if someone maybe has a personal care attendant that is with them, that they might be really comfortable walking next to, this type of environment doesn't probably provide that for them because it is a narrow environment for them to walk through in this path. It's dark. That's one that came up in there. Yes, right. So, you know, some people have some sensitivities to light and dark. And this obviously is an environment that's going to be a lot darker. Also might be harder if you have a visual impairment for you to be able to see all of the obstacles that are going to be in your way as you're walking through this type of environment with it being a little bit darker. Smells, that kind of come up in that allergy one that was mentioned, right? That you might have an allergy, but also some people have some sensory sensitivities that just like smells is going to be a trigger for them if it isn't something that they're used to or something that's very strong for them. And it's important to remember that people who have a sensory sensitivity may have increased abilities to see things, smell things, feel things, or it might be the other end of the spectrum where they might not be able to see as well. They might not smell things as well. They might not be able to touch and interact with them as well in the environment as someone else might. Sounds, I think that came up too when we talk about those directions, right? Giving some directions might be difficult because there might be a lot of like nature sound things that we're hearing that might be distracting or that might make it difficult for someone who has a hearing impairment in this type of environment. There's also the fear of the unknown, right? There's a lot of unknown with this type of environment where you can't see around the curves in the trail. You can't see everything that's all around you. So that can be challenging for people, and some sorts of disabilities make that fear of the unknown, that anxiety, really intensified. So that can be a big challenge as we think about different environments we might be in. And then finally, temperature. We have some people that are over or under sensitive to temperature. So they might get super hot. And especially if you think about in this type of environment, some days it might be a super hot day when you're hiking. Other days it might be a lot cooler, right? So there's that temperature piece to think about of regulating their body temperature and making sure that they're either warm enough, but not too warm at the same time. So a lot of things for us to think about in the environments that we use within our 4-H program. And one of the challenges is we know that our work doesn't happen all in a classroom, right? Or all in one location. You might be at a camp in this type of outdoor setting. One week, the next week you might be in the livestock show arena setting. The next week you might be at your county fair doing a judging day where it's in a chaotic 4-H building. So that the important part is, and we'll talk about this as we look at different types of accommodations, is that we need to be proactively thinking about the different environments that we're using in our 4-H program and the barriers that that might provide for someone with a disability. For those without a disability, you may be unaware of all of these things because you don't need to think about them. However, for those with a disability, that can be an extra cause of concern for them. All right, so with that, hopefully that gave you a little intro to think about just the wide spectrum of things we need to think about in our environments with young people or volunteers. We're going to jump in then to talk a little bit more about just, first of all, that overview of really what are accommodations, and then we'll talk more about some specific things that you might want to try to implement in your programming. Accommodations really are just strategies that we might use to reduce or eliminate any barriers that might be in place to learning or participation. So essentially, they are things that we can do to help make someone's learning experience better. Accommodations can happen really around 3 kind of categories, and you'll see this is kind of how I'll break them up when we talk about them. Adaptations to our materials that we use, the environment that we're in, how we lead people, so how we do that teaching method piece, and then also there's a little bit into how people participate, right? Because different people are going to participate in different ways, and that's okay. For someone, that might mean full participation in all of our activities. Someone else's desire might be that they're just in the room, that they're observing, that they're able to at least be in the environment with their peers. And another key piece when we talk about accommodations is to remember that accommodations can be used for everyone. We might develop an accommodation based on 1 or 2 people's requests for things that would help them be more successful. But many times the accommodations we're going to talk about are going to be good for everybody in the room, even if they weren't specifically put in place for everybody that's participating in your program. So as we talk about accommodations, I also want you to kind of keep in mind a few things. 1, we want to be creative. Think about things in a different way. Think about what you already have and how could you use that differently? Because there's a lot of materials that you already have that if you use them maybe for a different way than they were originally intended, they can be accommodation for someone. And we'll talk through some of those examples. Another key piece is to remember that every person is unique, so as is their disability. So that means that their accommodations need to be personalized. For example, not everyone with ADHD, for example, is going to benefit from fidgets. Some people, a fidget is going to be super beneficial because it allows them to release some energy and be able to focus on what you're doing. Other people, a fidget is going to be a distraction, and it's going to be something that is going to take away from their ability to fully participate in what you're doing. So just keep that in mind too, that you really need to customize accommodations based on the individual and what their requests are. And we talked a little bit too last time about the fact that people have to disclose if they have a disability. That is also true for accommodations, right? Like they need to tell us if they need an accommodation. Sometimes when we are interacting with someone, we might be able to make some guesses that maybe someone might benefit from an accommodation and we can put some of those in place. However, there's going to be other times where we have no idea that someone maybe gets an accommodation in school or at home that's really beneficial for them. So we need to make sure we're really creating those strong relationships with the participants in our program so they feel comfortable in asking for what they need. All right, so here in Minnesota, we have provided for our staff some wording that they can use to really just make families aware that we can make accommodation requests and that we want to make accommodation requests and we want them to be an active part of our program. So the wording that we provided here for our staff, and this is wording that really can go on registration forms, could go on a promotional flyer, wherever you are advertising or sharing about your 4-H program, really is really what we've said is that if you or your 4-H participants, so that's the place where, you know, a parent might make that accommodation or a mentor, whoever's working with that young person in their 4-H experience. If they need a disability related or other accommodations, so that might include anything that's not disability related, so maybe it's special housing for someone because of sexual orientation, let's say, that to participate in this program or you have questions about our physical accessibility of the event location, please contact, and that's a place for us to fill in the name, the phone number of whoever that program contact is at registration or at least 2 weeks prior to our program or cancellation. And the reason why we've asked for 2 weeks is we know that some accommodations are super easy to make, right? Someone could ask us for that accommodation in the morning of a program and we can just do it. It's easy. There are other accommodations that take a little bit more thought, or maybe they require us to gather some materials or do a little bit of research so that we can really do it right. So giving that 2-week notice allows staff enough time to be able to make those accommodations the right way. And also then hopefully gives us the ability to be able to meet those accommodations whenever we can, versus having to communicate to a family that we can't reach that accommodation that they're requesting. And then that kind of disclaimer you can see there of late notice may limit our ability to provide the requested accommodation. So again, kind of that, you know, if you don't give us that notice, we might not be able to do everything that you ask us, type of thing. And when we work with here in Minnesota, we work with our University of Minnesota Disability Resource Center. So they're on campus in the Twin Cities, and they really help us to be able to, if we need to, facilitate conversations with families. And that's, we can see there when we talk about reasonable accommodations, we really define that between 4-H and the Disability Resource Center as that we're going to explore accommodations through an interactive conversation so we can determine how we can make that experience possible. Doesn't mean that we are going to necessarily be able to do everything that the family asks for. Hopefully we can, but sometimes it's not possible given the environment, given the resources that we might have. You know, for example, if someone is going to residential camp and they're looking for a personal care attendant, we don't have the ability in our program to be able to necessarily provide that staff person to be with them. That's going to be someone who's trained and competent in that type of role. So for us, like, that means that a reasonable accommodation is that we'll help to pay for some of the expenses with a personal care assistant. So if they're going to residential camp, that might mean we're paying for their lodging, their meals, the registration fees for that personal care assistant, but it doesn't mean that we're providing that person for them. That would really be a family cost of that to actually provide that person to be there. And the reason that we've also said that is because we want that young person, if they do have a PCA, to be someone who is familiar with their child, knows what is going to be successful and not successful for them, and has that relationship already developed. And if we bring in a random person that we're saying, we're going to hire you to go be a PCA at camp, they're just not going to have the same positive experience because it's someone who doesn't know them and doesn't know how to work with them probably in a good way. So, so again, like we really say that it's about a conversation and figuring out what we can do, and knowing that there's some things we might not be able to do, but we're going to do our best to accommodate any requests that we do receive. Okay, any questions so far on anything that you have heard? I'm not hearing or seeing anything in the chat, so hopefully that's a good thing. Some of the strategies that we should use or think about when we're doing our 4-H programs. First of all, we need to assess the needs of the youth. So that means it might be an accommodation request form. It might be information that is submitted through 4-H online enrollment. It might be information someone puts in on a camp registration, whatever that looks like. And it might also be conversation with a family based on experiences that you've had in the past, or how well you know that family and that young person and what their needs are. So first we need to assess those needs of the youth to really figure out, like, what do they need to be successful? What might the barriers be? And then we need to address those barriers. So how can we help young people overcome the challenges that might be presented based on their disabilities? So what accommodations can we put in place? Then we need to determine what are those resources available. We know that there isn't endless supply of funds. There's not an endless supply of 4-H staff. There isn't an endless supply of experience, knowledge, expertise of people who might be helping to provide accommodations. So we need to figure out what do we have at our disposal and how can we use those to best provide experience for young people. And then a final and kind of key piece of that is we want to make sure that we are actively creating partnerships with providers, outside experts outside of our program, so we can really address the gaps in services that people are getting and help them to be able to increase their life skill development opportunities through 4-H. So it might be developing some partnerships and relationships with the local school district, if that's where your role's sphere of influence is. It might be developing some relationships with some local therapists or other people that can really help to give you some ideas and maybe provide you with some ideas for resources. It also might mean those partnerships might give you access to young people. So for example, if you are working in a role where you can partner with a school district and work with their special education summer school, that might be an opportunity for you to be able to connect with and provide program opportunities to young people that maybe wouldn't come to your 4-H program through some of the club or more traditional type experiences that you might be providing. So now we're going to jump in talking specifically about different types of accommodations. And I mentioned earlier, we're going to talk about that in kind of 3 kind of buckets of different types of accommodations. One of those are environmental. So those are really about the physical environment that our programs are taking place in. One of those is materials and supplies. So those are the things that we're providing at our programs for young people to do, for them to interact with. And the final one is teaching methods. So that's the way that we're teaching, the way that we're interacting with those young people in our program. And we'll jump in and talk about examples of each of those as we go to. Yeah, Leanne's got a comment in the chat that you may even have some amazing 4-H volunteers who have some expertise in this area. You definitely may. You might have a parent or volunteer who is a special education teacher, a pair at school, a therapist, whatever that might look like. That would be a great resource to tap into, and someone that you may already have a relationship developed with, and you might feel more comfortable in having conversations with, asking questions with, using them as a way to help gain some confidence and some comfort in moving forward with this type of work. So yeah, great comment about that. All right, so we're going to talk first then about environmental accommodations. So I'm going to give you some just broad ideas in this webinar for each of those 3 kind of areas of accommodations of things that you can do. And then in our next webinar, I'll actually like show you the tools that we're talking about here and dive a little bit deeper in that. But when we think about environmental accommodations, one of the first things that we need to be really aware of is the width of our aisles. Do we have wide enough aisles that a wheelchair user can get through them? And I know sometimes that can be challenging, but when we think about a classroom setting, probably a little bit easier. A more challenging one I think people might run into is, we have that environmental kind of environment I showed you with that walk through the woods. Another one to think about is, your 4-H exhibit buildings at county or state fair. Is there room between exhibits for someone with a wheelchair to be able to maneuver and look at all of the project work that you have in your building? So think about, are your aisles wide enough for a wheelchair? There are also some people who may have like an adaptive stroller. And my oldest daughter has severe nonverbal autism. And for her, like we used a large stroller for her probably until she was 9 or 10, right? So that was, and those adaptive strollers are much wider and much longer than like a baby stroller that you might see. So think about the width of your aisles. Other things, think about for those wheelchair users, are your supplies, your food, your drinks, all things that they're going to access within reach, or do they need to ask someone whenever they need those? We talked about in our previous webinar about presuming competence, about presuming that someone is able to do something until they tell you otherwise, and about allowing people to really have the opportunity to be independent, to be able to advocate for themselves. And by putting supplies at a height that is not within their reach, automatically creates that power dynamic of them being weak or less than and having to ask someone to help them all of the time. So just think about that. If you have people in your environment that are going to be in a wheelchair, or even someone that might be vertically challenged like myself, I'm not a very tall person, to have those things within reach so people can reach them. Another piece with that wheelchair user portion is to think about, what are your table heights? Can they roll a wheelchair underneath your tables to be able to sit at and work? Or are your tables too short for them to do that, or way too high that the table is going to be at their chin level, right? So think about, what are those heights that we're using with our tables? Another environmental accommodation is to use visuals, and we'll talk more about that later here today, but visuals really help someone with a disability to be able to not only hopefully hear when you're telling them things, but also see. So it's important that we're posting our rules, our social expectations in our environments, our agenda, if it's a meeting or some type of program, so they can kind of follow along. Visuals might also include instructions so that it can show you step by step how you're going to complete a project or activity. And visuals also might include labeling areas or rooms. So it might mean labeling one place that's where you're going to eat, another place where you're going to do your educational activities, another place where you're going to do your social things, your games, your songs, whatever that might look like. And really those visuals just provide some more clarity to people with and without a disability to know what's going to be happening and what happens where. And as I mentioned earlier, when we talk about these accommodations, so you might create an accommodation or something in place for one or two individuals that make that request, but many, many, many of these are going to benefit everybody in the room. So just remember that as you're making the accommodations. Another is to caption videos. It's super easy for us to do that now with all the technology that we have. So, if you're doing a Zoom call, make sure that you have your captions enabled. If you are creating a video you're going to post on YouTube or your 4-H site, make sure you're taking the time to make sure those captions are there and that you're reviewing those captions to make sure that they're actually accurate and changing them as you need to versus just going with whatever's there and assuming that it's good enough. Another environmental thing to think about is we want to reduce our distractions whenever we can. People that have sensory processing disabilities or that have things like autism, that have some of those sensory things just tied into them automatically, they might be super distracted and maybe not even able to focus or participate in your activity because of light, windows that are there, that they might see all kinds of other things that are more exciting than what you're maybe doing. That can be distracting for all of us. So if you have a sensory disability, it can be even more challenging. Noise, I know that my son, for most of his elementary age years, he had some very, very strong sensory sensitivities to noise. So when they would have fire drills, was super, super challenging for him to the point that he would have anxiety about that the entire school year after it happened once, until we got into like being able to have him get notification ahead of time that that was going to happen, or he might just be outside of the school when those things happen. So think about that. Think about also the clutter. So how many things are in the space where someone is at? The more clutter, the more distraction that there can be when you're doing those things. Susan has a question. Can you suggest a program that puts captions on a video after it's recorded? I don't have any great ones. Zoom will automatically do that, right? And you can edit those. YouTube will do the same thing when you post a video and you can edit those. We also use here in Minnesota Cultura Media Space, which is like a academic version of YouTube where we do those too. But like I said, most of them will automatically do that caption. But again, you're going to want to go in and edit it. For us, like we find that there's a lot of things that YouTube or Zoom or any of the other captioning things don't understand, like 4-H. They have no idea what 4-H is. Like it'll never ever say 4-H in there. So you always have to edit that, right? Or there might be other things that it doesn't catch when you're doing that. But all of those do have an ability to download a transcript and be able to edit those things. So So yeah, I don't have a great like example of here's one that you would do, because here we just do it, like I said, through Zoom, and we edit them that way, or through YouTube, or our academic version that we use here. But great question. But there's a lot of platforms that will do some automatic editing or captioning, but you will need to edit those some for sure. Another environmental thing to think about is providing fidgets. And as I mentioned earlier, fidgets can be super beneficial for some people, distracting for others. The important piece when we talk about fidgets is to remember that they're not toys. Some people might use a fidget as a toy at home. I know like all of like the pop fidgets have been super, super popular in the last few years, and people have them at home as toys, right? But for someone who has a disability that benefits from fidgets, we're using them as a tool for them to be able to get out some sensory energy and be able to focus better on what you're doing. So here in Minnesota, we've given all of our counties and regional offices these accommodation kits, as well as some of our clubs that you're going to see next time. And there's some fidgets. And the key piece is just making sure that with all of these accommodation tools, that you have them available for people to use, so they don't have to ask for them. We don't want them to have to like always ask, because they're always asking in many environments that they're in. And we don't want them to have to feel like they need to draw attention to themselves in order to get their needs met. So have fidgets available on your tables when you're doing a meeting, a program, and people can choose to use them if they're beneficial to them, or choose not to if they don't see it as a benefit to them. And then another environmental thing to think about is, do you have the ability to create a quiet space for breaks? So someplace outside of the chaos of your 4-H program that they can go, maybe to have some sensory tools to be with, maybe have some headphones, some calming music, a space that they can maybe do some breathing techniques that they need to help them really get out some of their sensory needs, rebalance themselves, calm themselves down, so that they can come back to your space where everybody's at and be able to fully participate when they're ready to do that. So those are a few ideas of some environmental accommodations that are things that we can just automatically put in place for all of our programs that we're doing. Another way for us to think about this is we do have a facility accessibility checklist that I created, I don't know, a while ago, probably 5, maybe even 10 years ago now. And really it's the ability for us to think about, and you can see a picture, kind of the screenshot of what the beginning of that looks like, to think about our outdoor spaces that we're using, our parking lots, our entrances to our buildings, the sidewalks that we have, all of those pieces, the restroom and shower facilities, if that's something that you're going to be using for your program, the hallways, doors, ramps, elevators, all of those things if we're using a multi-level facility. And then finally, just some of the safety concerns that we might want to think about with an environment. On this, and you'll get this as a link when you're all done with this webinar, there's just a series of questions that you can see on there that are kind of broke into these type of categories. And you answer them yes, no, or NA if it's not something that's applicable to your facility. If you mark no, you can see there's bullets under each one that gives you ideas of how you can improve those type of accessibility challenges that are in place with your facility. Also want to acknowledge that we don't always have full control over the facilities that we're using. So this is really an awareness piece. It might be an awareness if there's some things that you can do to make the space more accessible. It might also be awareness that you might need to consider sometimes a different space to use than what you've been using, because it just isn't accessible and there aren't ways to overcome those accessibility challenges. Some things to think about, for example, it might, there's a question about, do you have push buttons for doors to open automatically for someone in a wheelchair that needs that? There are a surprising amount of locations that don't have that. When I was working locally, our office was on the fairgrounds and we were a government office, right, a county office. None of our doors had push buttons. So for us to think about how do we overcome that? Obviously, we can't pick up and move our 4-H activities outside our 4-H fairgrounds, right? We also couldn't move our office outside of our extension office. So that meant that, for day camps or a meeting, we just always had the doors propped or had a greeter who would hold the doors open for everyone as they came and left the building. So we automatically were thinking about how do we, in a different creative way, overcome some of the physical accessibility challenges that we really don't have any control over at all. Dustin had a question: how many offices still have knobs and not handles? yeah, I think there's probably a lot of them out there that do, right? And knobs are a lot more difficult for someone that might have some motor difficulties with to be able to maneuver. So yeah, I think there's a lot of them like that. So, so this allows you really to think about what are the challenges that might be in place for your facility? Are there ways that you can overcome those? Or in some situations, are you better off looking for a different location to hold your activity? All right, any questions on that physical accommodation piece? And as I said, this will kind of be an overview today of these type of categories of accommodations. Okay, I'm not hearing or seeing any. I wanted to provide here a note about assistive technology because this will kind of lend itself into our teaching methods, but also into our materials and supplies that we provide. Assistive technology, if you're not familiar with that term or what it is, those are computer modifications that are used to increase accessibility. Some of the things might be when we look at a presentation like this, or other things might be captions, might be the contrast on our screen between the dark and light, or the colors that we're using to make them more easily read. It might be using voice output, so having an option for people to hear versus like having to read things all of the time. It might be a transcript on the other end, so someone can read while they're also following along. It also might be using touchscreens rather than a mouse, because a mouse can be hard for people to navigate and maneuver, especially like if you're using a laptop and you have that little like keypad where you're trying to do that. I think there's a pretty big learning curve for people who don't have fine motor challenges when they're using those. So if you have fine motor challenges, that can be super difficult, where a touchscreen allows you to be able to do that a little bit easier. Another type of assistive technology might be an augmentative and alternative communication device. So an AAC is what we call those. And those are going to be probably almost all the time, if not all the time, provided by the family. It might be a phone or a tablet that someone might use to communicate. So for example, my daughter, as I mentioned earlier, is nonverbal. So she doesn't have any words at all. She's 14 years old. So for us, that means she has a communication device that she is able to push buttons to do some communication or answer some questions with us. So you may have someone that might bring one of those to a program. So like take your cue from them and how you might want to interact with that. And hopefully a parent is going to reach out to you and let you know when those type of things might be coming to your program. Some other assistive technologies, there's a lot of different resources that you can use as magnifiers. So it makes that text on a screen, or even like on a book. There's things that you can like hold up to a book that will magnify that so it's easier to read. And there's also a lot of talking books, right? Those audio books that allow someone to be able to hear something versus seeing them. So a lot of assistive technologies that we might also put into place. A really low-key assistant technology might also be if you're having someone read and answer questions, it might be having someone physically read them to them versus them having to see them on a worksheet, or it might be someone writing things for people. So that's just a little bit of a note about assistive technology, which you might experience at some point in your 4-H programming. All right, with that, we're going to jump into talking a little bit about some material and supply accommodations. One of the first things you remember is that simple is good, right? The supplies that we're providing, the more simple we can make them, the better. That's going to be good for those who are utilizing them, but also those who are providing them. We also want to remember, as I mentioned earlier, that visuals really support focus and understanding. So when we can provide visuals, it allows people to hear things, see things in a different way, and really helps them to better understand what they're doing and what they're supposed to be learning. Another key piece is to use what you already have. There's a lot of things that we have on hand that we can use in a different way than maybe it was intended to make an accommodation for someone. Another thing to remember is we want to be creative. So think about, are there different new ways we can use something or ways that we can lean into a family to really think about how we can be creative in what we're doing as far as that supplies that we're providing. And another key piece is remember that we want to use a variety of materials. So think about things that are different textures for someone. Think about different skill levels. Not everybody is going to be at the same skill level and able to maybe complete things with the same materials at the same rates. We also want to think about different sizes of the things we're going to use, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we kind of jump in here. Different shapes. Some people might benefit from example like of triangular pencils or writing utensils versus like what we typically see as those round ones. And think about different colors. So different colors can be useful for someone. If someone is colorblind, some colors they can't see at all, right? So think about what are those different colors that we can use that can help someone to be more successful. So when we think about fine motor, we're going to kind of jump through in a few different ways around our materials and supplies and kind of break them out. But when we think about fine motor, those are things that require us to do small finger movements. So things like writing, manipulating little things that we might be doing. So some specific accommodations you might do to help someone with a fine motor difficulty might be to provide some grips. So that might be like pencil grips themselves, and I'll show you a bunch of those when we talk about our accommodation kits. It might also be using grip tape, which I'll show you during that one too, but grip tape is basically tape that feels like sandpaper on the outside of it. So it's really rough and allows somebody to get a better grip on something. And you can use that on utensils, paintbrushes, tools you might be using, so that you can really be able to help them grip those things better. Sometimes athletic tape also can be useful for that too, because it provides a less slippery surface for someone to grab onto. Velcro or shelf liners can also be useful for stabilizing or helping things stay in place. So you might cut a piece of shelf liner paper and place it on the table in front of where someone's working so that their sheets of paper don't slide around the table. And also might be putting Velcro or shelf liner paper on the back of a ruler or other things that people are using that help it really just stay in the space that you want to and reduce the ability of it to slide around. Some other things to think about are, can you offer cups that have handles or straws or bowls that are a little bit deeper so that it's easier for someone to like be able to scoop with their spoon and not like tip it over the side of it. There's also a lot of different like spoons and eating utensils that are adaptive, that are made for people that provide them different support. Some writing support things to think about is, can someone use a laptop instead of having to write all of the time? Because writing can be a challenge. My son, he's 11, and fine motor difficulty is a big thing for him. For him, his writing is almost illegible, even to me as his mom. And I feel like it is worse now than it was maybe when he was younger. So for him, like if we have opportunities to write or to type things on a computer, that is really beneficial for him because one, someone else can read it then. Two, it also means a lot less frustration for him because he thinks he should be able to write better than he can because his peers can write better, right? Like it's not as difficult for him. So think about a laptop versus handwriting things sometimes. Speech to text, right? So like if it is hard for them to handwrite or to type, can they talk? And then they'll use that speech to text feature on a computer to be able to like record what they're saying. Also raised line paper, which I'll show you next time too. It's really cool paper that the lines on it are raised above the regular flat sheet of paper so that they can feel with their pencil as they're going over where the lines are, but also with their other hand that's kind of controlling the paper so that they can make sure they're staying in their writing spaces. Another thing is to, like if you're using a ruler, you could add a ball on top to hold, or again, that shelf liner paper I mentioned, mounted scissors, which are the image above. And I'll show you how to use those in our next one. A slant board, again, like it really just helps to be able to create a surface where they can write. And essentially it's a board or almost like a clipboard that's raised a little bit on one end so it slants their paper a little bit. So it's easier for them to write than it is on a flat sheet of paper. So another kind of idea. Some things when we talk about materials that might support our focus or ability to really pay attention to what we're doing. Think about, again, having simple written or picture directions versus just saying something. Add visuals whenever you can to illustrate content so that not only can they hear something, but they can see what you're talking about. Highlight keywords in directions or text. So just use a highlighter, right? Like if there's certain questions or parts of a question that is really important for someone to understand, highlight those things so that they can kind of tune out all of the other things that are on the paper and focus on the things that they need to. Mark your text with Post-it notes or flags. Really, again, it's that same concept of directing them to where they need to see and where they need to learn. Use graph paper to keep numbers in line rather than having to just use a blank sheet of paper where things might be all over the place. Use high contrast colors so that there's a lot of different excitement on the page and people are easier for them to see and focus on. And then, you use different templates. So rather than giving someone a blank sheet of paper to work off of, is there a way that you can provide part of the content or part of what they're supposed to do and they can kind of fill in the blanks on things. So those are some ways that you can help support focus for young people. Ways to support that understanding. So really that capturing that idea of people taking in and understanding what you're talking about. When we think about text, remember that different people are going to have different reading levels. So we might need to provide text at different reading levels. The worksheet that we give one person to complete might not be the same worksheet that is going to be at the reading level of someone else. Having audio options is a really good way too to help with that text, because then they don't have to read everything. They can hear it. And that audio option might be someone reading to them. It might be like having a video for them to watch that's going to give the same content. Also think about the directions you're providing. Again, like write them out in addition to just saying them. Use pictures, model it for people so they can actually like see what they should be doing. We think about our content. It's really important whenever we can that we reduce the amount of reading and details. We might have a lot of things that we want to share with someone, but they probably don't need to know all of them. So just share the stuff that they need to do. And then also we can support understanding by using models, manipulatives to teach. So rather than just talking about something, having something there so someone can see it, they can touch it, they can feel it. That will help them to better understand the concepts that you're trying to help them understand. So, I just want to talk also a little bit about universal design for learning. So this is probably a term that if you have been doing this work for very long or you are in education as your background, you probably have heard this, but it's really a teaching approach that one works to accommodate all the needs of and abilities of our learners, and it two eliminates any unnecessary hurdles. So it really helps to customize the learning for young people so that they can be as successful as possible. And that final category of accommodations is about how we're teaching, right? The actual methods we're using. Some of the key pieces is to remember that we want to use simple, clear communication. So, don't talk in jargon or all of the terms we might use. Don't use language that's going to be confusing. Use simple, clear, short language whenever you can. Use a variety of communication and learning styles. So again, like written communication, verbal communication, all of those pieces are important. And think about the different types of learning styles that someone might have and try to teach to those. Use hands-on activities whenever we can, which for us in 4-H really isn't that challenging because that's what our program is all about. So, just make sure that you're always including that. We also want to directly teach the expectations and procedures. So we want to make sure that we are very clear on the social expectations, the rules of the space, and how people should do that. Because if we aren't clearly communicating that, it's really hard for people to live up to the expectations that we're setting. Another key piece is to praise positive behaviors, which is just good classroom management in general, but really to identify and help point out those things that are going really good so people can want to do the same thing. Another key teaching method is to make sure that we're using routines. That's really important because if people know what to expect and what's predictable, it's going to be a lot less anxiety and it's going to be a lot easier for them to go with what you're wanting them to do. We think about, for many of us, we probably have like a to-do list or a routine that we use in the morning or throughout our day. Same is useful for someone with a disability who already might have increased anxiety. And another one is just to have peer support and mentoring. That's a key part of our 4-H programs, but especially important for a young person with a disability. Some other things to keep in mind is we might mean allowing extra time. We might have an idea of how long an activity is going to take, and that might be right on or it might not. You might find that some people with disabilities that have a little bit slower processing time might need extra time to work on it, and that's okay. We also want to make sure that whenever we can, we're reducing the amount of writing, pencil work that's required. So, can someone else do a writing role for them? Can they show their learning in a different way that isn't writing necessarily? And then I mentioned earlier a few times, visual supports are really important. Those cues, they help provide structure, allow someone maybe to make a choice or communicate. On the slide here, you can see the incredible 5-point scale. I'm not going to talk a lot about it because we talked about it last time, but it's a really important tool for us to use in how we're doing our teaching. We also might want to use daily or activity schedules, which I'll show you, and social stories, which we'll talk a little bit about here too in the next little bit we have left. So social or visual support is really any type of picture or visual that helps someone better understand something. They might, as I mentioned earlier, they might illustrate content or instructions. They might be pictures of something to help someone like actually see what you're talking about. It might be a graphic organizer like pictured on the screen. It might be a choice board. So that's something that someone might use where you might provide 2 or 3 pictures or options of things, and people can use that to communicate and pick the things they'd like to do. Might also include picture cards, which I'll show you some examples of here shortly, but essentially they're just cards that show what you're going to do throughout the course of something. It also could be a visual schedule, which I'll show you. I'll also show you a first, then, next here shortly, and a social story. But those are all examples of visuals, but essentially they're anything that shows someone visually what you're going to be doing or talking about. All right, so visual schedules, and you'll get links to all of these because these are on our Minnesota 4-H site. The first one is a first, then, next, and this is a pretty cool and powerful schedule. With this, you can see there's 3 boxes. It might be less boxes depending upon the person's ability. But really, this is designed as a way to help us get through things that maybe aren't as desirable to get the thing that we want to do. So if we think about it in the morning, I'm not a coffee drinker, but I love hot chocolate. So like my first might be, first I respond to emails, then I respond to voicemails. Next, I can go get another cup of hot chocolate. So it allows people to see the reward thing they want to do and helps them get through the less desirable things, knowing that the thing they want to do is coming up. Visual or the today's schedule example is kind of a similar concept. It really is like that to-do list we might have every day. I know for me, like having a to-do list makes me feel way more organized and like provides structure and reduces anxiety for my day. And that's very true for many of the young people that are in our program. This type of structure you see on the screen, the big box is for either words or a picture, depending upon somebody's ability. And it would be kind of the tasks, like it might be an after school program. We're going to come in, we're going to do a welcome activity. We're going to have a snack. We're going to do a like a learning activity. Then we're going to play a game, and then we're going to go home for number 5. So as you do those, you either check off in the small box, like with a whiteboard marker. You could have this laminated, or it might be Velcroed and you're moving the picture from the big box and then to the small box as you do it. And this might be like something you have posted in front of the whole room. It might also be something that somebody with a disability has at their workspace for them to be able to follow along and like check off as they do it. This also really reduces that constant question of, what are we doing today? What are we doing today? What are we doing today? Because it is right there posted for everybody to see at the same time. So another great visual schedule to use. And again, you need to kind of base this on the person's ability. It might be 5 things. It might be less things. It might be like pictures of what you're going to do. It might be words. And it really just depends on where people are at in your space. Picture cards, I mentioned those. So picture cards, you can see here, these are picture cards for a club meeting, which is one of the, if not the most common experience our 4-Hers have here in Minnesota. And these can be used on any one of those visuals that I just showed you, as well as even just like cut it at a table for someone to just kind of flip through as they're doing things. And it allows them to be able to, again, see what they're going to do and follow along throughout the course of your activity. And Leanne's got a little note in there. So she's got a note from our discussion last time regarding simple and clear communication. We want to enhance the clarity in communication. Don't use any of those expressions. Yeah, I talked about last time, right? That example of it's raining cats and dogs. Those figurative language things, people can really misinterpret them because they might think like it is actually raining cats and dogs outside, which some of us were like, really? But yes, like they totally might. And that leads to those heightened emotions, fear, confusion, that stress, right? That we don't need to provide. So that's why I said that clear communication, simple communication is really important. All right, I also want to share with you social stories, and you'll get links to these, but a social story is a story that walks someone through what they're going to do, what they're going to experience, so that they can prepare for that. And they would use these stories and they would read these ahead of time with their family. So we have 2 right now that are on our website. One is club meetings, since that is like the most common experience our young people have in 4-H here. And the other one is 4-H judging at the fair. So that like county fair entry day, which is probably like the most overwhelming experience that someone is going to do in our 4-H program. And with these, it talks through like what they're going to see, what they're going to do. And it kind of outlines the whole process. These examples, when you get the links to these, you'll see they don't have any pictures on them, and that is intentional. Some young people are gonna be fine if you draw and stick pictures. Yep, like that's cool. Other people are going to actually need to see like a picture of who those club officers are. They're gonna be sitting at that front table, or see a picture of like the 4-H building and where they're going to go to do each of the steps. So, so you need to kind of work with your families to figure that out. And some won't need any pictures at all, right? They can just see the text and they can comprehend that. And through those, like when we talk through, for example, that judging at the fair, it talks through every step that they're going to do when they get there. So they're going to check in. Many of our county fairs here, like 4-Hers get a wristband that they wear through the whole fair that gets them in and out free. Might also be kind of like their like ticket or pass to get their 4-H special, quote unquote, in their food stands, kind of that discounted meal. So it talks about that, you know, you're going to put this wristband on. It's not going to be too tight. It's not going to be too loose. Like you're going to wear it for the week and it'll be fine. So it really walks them through like the social nuance pieces that they might not automatically pick up on, as well as all the things there. So like talks about the fact that you're going to leave your 4-H project there, but you'll get it back, right? So that anxiety that might come from someone thinking like, I don't get my 4-H project anymore. Like it's gone. I left it at the building. Really helps them to understand like all of the pieces that happen with that people don't just automatically understand. And again, like any of the other accommodations, every family would probably benefit from reading that 4-H judging at the fair. Because all of our families that are new to 4-H, that's an overwhelming experience for those who are experienced and have been in it. So it's really helpful for those new families to get an idea of what they're getting themselves into as they go through that day too. So, so you'll want to check those out. And again, if you create social stories, lots of templates online to do that. I mean, if you search social stories, there's social stories for everything. Hand washing, there's social stories for riding a bus, like you name it, there's a social story for it. For us in our family, we used one for trick-or-treating because my son wasn't very verbal at the time. We used it to help him learn the words of trick-or-treating, and also some of the social nuances of like, you don't ring the doorbell 5 times, you don't go in someone's house, like you don't like grab the whole bucket of candy, right? To help him understand that, like all of those social pieces of it. We also used it like for going to school, so he could see his classroom, his teacher, all of that, and we could read it like for every day for like a month ahead of school. So he would kind of be prepared for that. So lots of different ways you can use social stories. All right, with that, we're kind of getting up to our last few minutes, as you can see on our schedule. So got some questions. We'll take some of those too. But I'm also, while we're doing that, I'm going to flip to the next screen so you can kind of see that. I have 2 requests of you. One, I would love to get a little reflection on, you know, what you heard about, what you think is valuable. And then I have an evaluation form that I would love for you to complete so I can get some feedback from you so I can make sure that this series is as beneficial as possible. And we're really meeting the needs of all of you there in North Dakota. So if you can, we'll kind of do like 3 things. 1, questions, ask those away, right? Unmute, ask questions, put them in the chat box, whatever works. And then if you can also reflect on and put in the chat box or unmute, whatever you're comfortable with, what was the most valuable thing for you today? And if you've heard of or used anything else for accommodations, because this is really just like the tip of the iceberg. There are so many different accommodations that we can talk about. And like I said, I'll show you like actual tools in our next one so you can actually see all of these things, and we'll dive a little bit deeper into really that like materials that we talked about, that materials and supplies is really what we're going to dive into next time with the accommodation kit. And then my third request is do the evaluation form, please. So you get that. You'll also get that link, I think, from either Leanne or myself, whoever sends that follow-up email. But with that, if you can, like I said, ask questions, share your reflections, and do the evaluation. We'll do that as we wrap up the last few minutes. But hopefully this was valuable for all of you. I know I gave you a ton of information. This is really, like I said, just a broad overview of here's lots of different things you could do. And then we'll really jump into the material and supply portion of it next time. You see an answer. This has got to be something that was a useful thing, right? The specific ideas to make accommodations like grip tape, shelf liner paper, poppets, all of those things that we'll look at kind of in that supply kit next time. Yeah, like there's tons and tons of different accommodations that we can make. We just have to think creatively. And one of the other key pieces is ask volunteers, ask parents, ask those people who know those young people well, because they can probably share with you a ton of different things that they utilize at school, at home, that they could bring into your 4-H setting as well.
This has been awesome, Darcy. I always learn things from you, so it's really fun.
I'm glad. Like I said, I know it's a lot. I just threw a lot of information at you. This is probably like the most, I feel like the most intense one we're going to do, because there's just so many accommodations that we can make.
Dustin had a great comment. Until you're asked for help, do not assume. Let them be the first in control. For example, offer your arm to the vision impaired. Don't take their arm. We talked about that last time, but wow, really powerful statement. Thanks, Dustin.
Yeah. So yeah, again, if you weren't at the last one, make sure that you look at that link for that disability etiquette, because there's a lot of things that we might just automatically do or assume that can be disrespectful, that can be taking away someone's power, self-advocacy, abilities to do things. So yeah, definitely, Dustin, that's a great comment. Another idea here about that accommodation idea is really useful. Opening your eyes up to ways to accommodate that you didn't think about. Yeah, I mean, Amber, that's the key piece is, it doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be expensive. There's a lot of things that we can just do that are simple that we might not even think about unless we need to. So some more ideas for accommodation, intern with a disability soon. So yeah, this is excellent background information for sure. Certificate of completion. Yeah, I'm sure we can do probably a certificate for one of the sessions, this whole series. Leanne and I can work through how we want to do all of that. But yeah, we can definitely provide something.
That's a great idea.